There are a total of 33 vertebrae, and they can be split up on whether they move or not. There are 24 vertebrae that articulate with each other and they're mobile, they can move. And they include the 7 cervical vertebrae, the 12 thoracic, and the 5 lumbar. And then there are 9 vertebrae that are fused together, they're non-mobile, and they include the 5 sacral vertebrae and the 4 coccyx. The 24 mobile vertebrae make up the superior portion of the vertebral column, also known as the spinal column, and then the 9 fused vertebrae make up the inferior portion of the spinal column. The goal of the vertebrae and the vertebral column is to protect the spinal cord and support the rest of the body. So as we go from the superior to the inferior portion of the vertebral column, we first start off with the cervical vertebrae. These are the vertebrae in the neck and they help support the head, which weighs about 10 to 12 pounds. There are a total of 7 cervical vertebrae and they're labeled C1 through C7. As we work our way down, we then move on to the thoracic vertebrae. These are the vertebrae of the mid-upper back and they help hold the rib cage and protect the heart and lungs. They're less mobile than the cervical and lumbar vertebrae. There are a total of 12 thoracic vertebrae and they're labeled T1 through T12. Next we have the lumbar vertebrae, and these are the vertebrae of the lower back. They're much larger in size because they support the rest of the body and they also help us when we lift heavy things. There are a total of 5 lumbar vertebrae and they're labeled L1 through L5. So as we said before, the 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar vertebrae make up the 24 mobile vertebrae, and there's an easy way to remember how many there are in each of these vertebral segments. Just remember breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For breakfast, you can remember 7 a.m., and this will correlate with the 7 cervical vertebrae. For lunch, 12 p.m., this will correlate with the 12 thoracic vertebrae. And for dinner, 5 p.m., this will help you recall the 5 lumbar vertebrae. Next, we have the 9 vertebrae that are fused together. Remember we said there's 5 sacral vertebrae and 4 coccyx. Starting with the sacrum, these are 5 fused vertebrae that are labeled S1 through S5, and they connect with the hip bones to form the pelvis. Lastly, we have the coccyx, which is the tailbone, and these are 4 vertebrae that are fused together. There's an intervertebral disc located between each of the mobile vertebrae with the exception of between C1 and C2. The intervertebral disc forms a cushion between the vertebral bodies so the bones don't rub together. Let's now take a closer look at the disc. There are 2 main components to an intervertebral disc, the annulus and the nucleus, and they actually function opposite of each other. The annulus is made up of fibers that crisscross and help hold the vertebral bodies together, whereas the nucleus is a gel-filled sac that pushes the vertebral bodies away from each other. A fairly common back problem is what's called a herniated disc. This is when the nucleus protrudes through the annulus and compresses on spinal nerves, which can cause quite a bit of back pain. Now that we have a good understanding of the different vertebral segments and the intervertebral discs, we're going to talk about the anatomy of each of the vertebrae. The overall anatomy of each vertebra is fairly similar, with the exception of C1, C2. They have a little bit of a different shape, so we're going to start off by talking about those first.